The streets of Queens hummed with life in the autumn of 1963. The borough sprawled across the eastern edge of New York City, a patchwork of neighborhoods where working-class families built their version of the American dream. Tree-lined avenues stretched between apartment buildings and modest homes. Subway trains rattled overhead. Corner diners served coffee and conversations that lasted for hours. It was a place where people knew their neighbors, where children played stickball in the streets, where doors were sometimes left unlocked. Nobody imagined that October would bring a darkness that would haunt the community for more than 60 years. Eleanor Grace Mitchell was 24 years old that fall. She worked as a secretary at a law firm in Manhattan, commuting every morning on the subway from her apartment in Forest Hills. She was engaged to be married the following spring to a man named Thomas Webb, a school teacher she had met at a church social 2 years earlier. Friends described Eleanor as kind and meticulous, the type of person who always remembered birthdays and wrote thank you notes by hand. She volunteered at the local library on weekends, helping children with their reading. Her life was ordinary in the best possible way, filled with small joys and quiet routines. Eleanor lived alone in a garden apartment on a quiet residential street, a first-floor unit with windows that faced a small courtyard. Her landlord was a man named Vincent Caruso, who owned the building and lived in the unit directly above hers. Caruso was 52 years old, a widower who worked as a building superintendent for several properties in the area. Tenants found him helpful but somewhat intrusive. He had keys to every apartment and sometimes entered without notice, claiming he needed to check for maintenance issues. Eleanor had mentioned to her fiancé that Caruso made her uncomfortable, that she sometimes felt he was watching her, but she never filed a formal complaint. On the evening of October 19th, Eleanor attended a dinner party with friends in Manhattan. She left around 10:30, telling everyone she needed to catch the subway home because she had work the next morning. Multiple witnesses saw her board the train at Lexington Avenue. Security personnel at the Forest Hill station remembered seeing a young woman matching her description exit around 11:15. She was wearing a blue coat and carrying a black purse. She walked toward the street where her apartment was located. That was the last confirmed sighting of Eleanor Grace Mitchell alive. When Eleanor failed to arrive at work the following morning, her supervisor called her apartment. No answer. He tried again at lunch. Still nothing. By mid-afternoon, concerned, he contacted Thomas Webb. Thomas immediately drove to Eleanor's apartment and knocked on her door. Silence. He found Vincent Caruso and asked him to open the apartment. Caruso seemed reluctant, but eventually retrieved his keys. What they found inside would become one of the most disturbing crime scenes in Queens history. Eleanor was lying on the floor of her bedroom, partially clothed, surrounded by signs of a violent struggle. Furniture was overturned, lamps were broken, the bed sheets were torn and stained with blood. The medical examiner would later determine that she had been sexually assaulted, beaten with a blunt object, and strangled. The cause of death was asphyxiation due to ligature strangulation. The time of death was estimated between midnight and 2 in the morning. She had been alive when her attacker left her, dying slowly over what could have been hours. The New York Police Department dispatched a team of detectives to the scene. Among them was Detective James Patrick O'Connor, a 38-year-old veteran of the Homicide Division who had worked in Queens for 12 years. He stood in that small bedroom, taking in the brutality of what had occurred, and felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. This was not a random act. This was personal, methodical, and cruel. Whoever did this had taken their time. Evidence collection began immediately. Fingerprints were lifted from multiple surfaces. Fibers were collected from Eleanor's clothing and the surrounding area. Blood samples were taken for typing, the most advanced forensic technique available in 1963. The apartment showed no signs of forced entry, which suggested Eleanor either let her attacker in or the person had a key. Detective O'Connor interviewed Vincent Caruso, who claimed he had been home alone the previous evening and had heard nothing unusual. Caruso allowed officers to search his apartment and voluntarily gave his fingerprints for comparison. He seemed cooperative, even concerned, asking repeatedly if there was anything he could do to help. The investigation expanded quickly. Detectives interviewed everyone in the building and the surrounding neighborhood. They spoke to Eleanor's co-workers, her friends, her family. They questioned her fiancé, Thomas Webb, extensively, as partners and spouses were always primary suspects in cases like this. But Thomas had an airtight alibi. He had been at a school function until nearly midnight, surrounded by colleagues and parents, and had gone home to his apartment in Brooklyn afterward. Phone records confirmed he had called Eleanor's number several times that evening, worried when she did not answer. He was cleared within 48 hours. The forensic results began to return. The blood type found at the scene included Eleanor's, type O positive, but also another type, AB negative, which was rare, occurring in less than 1% of the population. The fingerprints lifted from the bedroom did not match anyone in the system. Fiber analysis revealed dark wool threads that appeared to be from a coat or jacket. It was good evidence, but without a suspect to compare it against, it led nowhere. Detective O'Connor could not shake his suspicion of Vincent Caruso. The landlord had access, he had opportunity. Witnesses confirmed that he often paid unusual attention to female tenants, but there was no physical evidence connecting him to the crime. His fingerprints did not match those found at the scene. His blood type was A positive, not AB negative. Without something concrete, the district attorney refused to pursue charges. Caruso remained free, living in the apartment above where Eleanor had died, collecting rent from tenants who now locked their doors and looked over their shoulders. Months passed with no breakthrough. The case consumed Detective O'Connor. He worked it obsessively, reviewing evidence, re-interviewing witnesses, searching for the detail he had missed. His wife begged him to let it go, to accept that some cases could not be solved. But he could not forget Eleanor's apartment, the violence that had occurred there, the life that had been stolen. He attended her funeral and met her parents, immigrants from Ireland who had come to America believing it was a place of safety and opportunity. They asked him in broken English if their daughter's killer would be caught. He promised he would never stop trying. The case went cold by the summer of 1964. New crimes demanded attention. Resources were diverted. Detective O'Connor was reassigned, but kept Eleanor's file in his desk. He pulled it out whenever he had spare time, reading through statements, looking at photographs, hoping something would click. Vincent Caruso continued to live and work in Queens, a quiet presence who inspired unease, but never faced consequences. In 1967, something happened that reignited interest in the case. A young woman named Patricia Donovan was found murdered in her apartment in Astoria, another Queens neighborhood about 4 miles from Forest Hills. The circumstances were eerily similar. She had been sexually assaulted, beaten, and strangled. Her apartment showed no signs of forced entry. She lived in a building managed by a superintendent who had access to all units. Detective O'Connor was immediately notified and drove to the scene. He stood in that apartment and felt the same chill he had experienced 4 years earlier. This was connected. It had to be. Investigation into the Donovan murder revealed that the building superintendent, a man named Frank DeLucci, had been questioned but not arrested. His alibi was weak. His behavior was suspicious, but again, there was insufficient evidence. Detective O'Connor requested permission to compare evidence from both cases. He discovered that the blood type found at the Donovan scene was also AB negative. The fiber evidence was similar. The method of entry, the type of assault, the brutality of the attack, all paralleled Eleanor Mitchell's murder. He was convinced they were looking for the same person. O'Connor began investigating whether there was any connection between Vincent Caruso and Frank DeLucci. He discovered they both worked for the same property management company in the late 1950s. They knew each other. They had worked in adjacent buildings at one point. But that alone was not enough to prove anything. The detective spent weeks building a timeline, checking records, interviewing former coworkers. He found 3 other unsolved assaults in Queens between 1960 and 1966, all involving women who lived in buildings managed by superintendents with access to keys. The pattern was undeniable. A predator was operating in the borough, hiding behind legitimate employment, using access and opportunity to target victims. Detective O'Connor presented his findings to his superiors and requested a task force to investigate all the connected cases. His request was denied. Resources were limited, the evidence was circumstantial, the department could not justify the expense based on theories and similarities. Frustrated but undeterred, O'Connor continued working the cases on his own time. He created charts connecting victims, locations, and suspects. He maintained files in his garage at home. His obsession strained his marriage and affected his health, but he could not let it go. Years turned into decades. Detective O'Connor retired in 1982 after 34 years with the NYPD. He left behind an active caseload, but took copies of Eleanor Mitchell's file with him. He worked it in retirement, updating himself on new forensic techniques, hoping that advances in science might provide answers that traditional investigation could not. When DNA analysis became available in the late 1980s, he contacted the crime lab and asked if biological evidence from the Mitchell case still existed. He was told that much of the physical evidence from cases that old had been destroyed or lost due to storage limitations. It was a devastating blow. Vincent Caruso died in 1994 at the age of 83. He had lived his entire life in Queens, never arrested, never charged, never held accountable for anything. Detective O'Connor attended his funeral, standing at the back of the chapel, watching the small gathering of mourners. He wanted to believe that justice existed somewhere beyond what courts could deliver, that men like Caruso faced reckoning eventually. But it felt hollow. In 2015, a cold case unit was established within the Queens District Attorney's Office. The unit was tasked with reviewing unsolved homicides using modern forensic technology. Among the first cases they selected was the 1963 murder of Eleanor Grace Mitchell. Detective Sarah Chen, a 32-year-old investigator with specialized training in forensic genealogy and DNA analysis, was assigned to lead the review. Detective Chen requested all physical evidence related to the case. She was told that most of it had been discarded, but a thorough search of the evidence warehouse revealed a box that had been mislabeled and overlooked. Inside were Eleanor's clothing items, carefully preserved in sealed bags. The fabric had degraded over 50 years, but biological samples were still detectable. Chen sent everything to a private forensic laboratory that specialized in extracting DNA from degraded evidence. The lab worked for 6 months, using cutting-edge techniques to isolate genetic material. They successfully obtained a partial DNA profile from biological evidence recovered from Eleanor's clothing. It was not a complete profile, but it was enough to compare against databases and conduct familial searches. Detective Chen submitted the profile to genealogy databases that allowed law enforcement searches. Within weeks, she had results. The DNA matched several individuals who were distant relatives of the suspect. She began the painstaking process of building family trees. The investigation led her to a family name that appeared repeatedly in Queens property management records from the 1950s and 60s. Following the genealogical trail, she identified a man named Vincent Anthony Caruso, deceased since 1994, as a likely match. But Caruso had been cremated, making direct comparison impossible. Chen needed another approach. She discovered that Caruso had a son from his first marriage, a man named Vincent Caruso Jr., who was living in Florida. Chen obtained a court order to collect DNA from Caruso Jr. The sample was analyzed and compared against the partial profile from Eleanor Mitchell's case. The results indicated a high probability of paternal relationship. Vincent Caruso Sr. was the source of the biological evidence found on Eleanor's clothing. After 52 years, the killer had been identified. The revelation sent shockwaves through the NYPD and the Queens community. Vincent Caruso had been a suspect from the beginning, questioned and released due to lack of evidence. He had lived for 30 more years after Eleanor's murder, managing buildings, holding keys, having access to vulnerable tenants. Detective Chen expanded her investigation, pulling records of all unsolved assaults and homicides in buildings where Caruso had worked. She found 7 cases between 1958 and 1972 that shared similar characteristics. DNA evidence existed for 3 of them. Comparisons confirmed that Caruso was responsible for at least 4 murders and 2 sexual assaults. The news was announced at a press conference attended by the families of victims, representatives from the NYPD, and the district attorney. The detective who had worked Eleanor's case originally, James Patrick O'Connor, was invited to attend. He was 89 years old, in declining health, but he sat in the front row as Detective Chen detailed how modern science had finally provided the answers he had sought for over half a century. When asked for comment, O'Connor's voice shook with emotion. He said he had never stopped believing that the truth would emerge. He said that Eleanor and the other victims deserved to have their stories told and their killer named. He said that justice delayed was still justice. Eleanor's fiancé, Thomas Webb, had died in 2008, never knowing who had murdered the woman he loved. Her parents had passed decades earlier, but her younger sister, now 78 years old, attended the press conference. She spoke about living 62 years without answers, about the fear and suspicion that had poisoned their family and their community. She said that knowing the truth, even though it came too late to prosecute, brought a measure of peace. She thanked Detective Chen and the cold case unit for refusing to let her sister be forgotten. The case sparked renewed interest in reviewing old evidence from unsolved crimes. The NYPD allocated additional funding to the cold case unit and expanded its staff. Detective Chen became a national advocate for using forensic genealogy to solve historical crimes. She lectured at conferences and trained other investigators in the techniques that had identified Caruso. She always began her presentations with Eleanor's photograph, a young woman in a blue dress, smiling at the camera, her whole future ahead of her. The building where Eleanor had lived was torn down in the 1990s, replaced with a small park. After the case was solved, the community installed a memorial bench with a plaque that read, "In memory of Eleanor Grace Mitchell and all victims of violence. May truth bring peace." It became a place where people stopped to reflect, to remember that behind every unsolved case was a person who mattered, a life that had value, a story that deserved to be told. Detective O'Connor died 6 months after the press conference. He was 90 years old. At his funeral, his children spoke about his dedication to his work and his inability to forget the victims whose cases went unsolved. They said that the resolution of Eleanor's case in his final year brought him closure he had never expected to receive. Detective Chen attended and delivered a eulogy praising his persistence and integrity. She said that his work had laid the foundation for everything that followed, that without his meticulous documentation and preservation of evidence, modern science would have nothing to analyze. The story of Eleanor Grace Mitchell became a testament to the long reach of justice and the power of persistence. For 62 years, her killer had remained unnamed, his crimes hidden behind the facade of normalcy and the limitations of forensic science. But time and technology eventually converged to reveal the truth. Vincent Caruso could not face trial or punishment, but his name would forever be associated with brutality and cowardice. The victims he harmed would be remembered not just for how they died, but for who they were, people with futures and families and dreams that deserved protection. The case remains a reference point for discussions about cold case investigations, forensic genealogy, and the importance of preserving evidence even when immediate solutions seem impossible. It is taught in criminal justice programs and cited in academic research. But for those who lived through it, for the families who waited decades for answers, it is not an academic exercise. It is a wound that finally stopped bleeding, a question that finally received an answer, a darkness that was finally brought to the light. Some losses can never be healed, but they can be honored. Some truths take generations to emerge, but they emerge nonetheless. That is what happened in Queens in 1963. That is what the cold case unit proved in 2015. Eleanor Grace Mitchell was not forgotten. Justice found her at last.